How are you doing, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Today, I want to talk about metabolism. Now, metabolism is a whole area that you can pretty much get a degree in. It's very, very vast. But since we've had an introduction of what biomolecules are, I wanted to talk about how these biomolecules work together to pretty much keep us alive. And this is metabolism. So, this is an overview of metabolism. All right, let's do this. So, when we're talking about metabolism, we have two types of metabolism. We have catabolism and anabolism, right? So all of these mechanisms are mechanisms that either make something or break something. So metabolism is the pretty much these processes that take the food that you eat, break it down into smaller parts, and then make use those smaller parts to make things that your cells and your body needs. So you have catabolism that is going to degrade the things that you have, and this degradation is going to produce energy and components that your body needs. And anabolism is the opposite. Anabolism is biosynthesis, meaning that anabolism is combining things. It combines smaller molecules to make bigger molecules, and this anabolism requires energy. So the biggest difference between anabolism and catabolism is one produces energy, the other one uses that energy. And another difference is one breaks big things into smaller parts, and then the other one is combining smaller things into bigger things. So anabolism is the one that puts things together. Now, when it comes to metabolism, we also have metabolic pathways, and these pathways are intricate pathways that show you where things go. So let me give you an example. This, is a mess, but these are all metabolic pathways, the pathways that show you like, okay, this combines with this to give you this and that and that. So this map right here is showing you a bunch of I recognize a bunch of these. So these are a lot of biochemical pathways on how your body regulates fats, sugars, and other things like lipids and amino acids. So these this is an overview of the cell metabolism. Every single individual here, we call it a metabolite. A metabolite is just something that participates in metabolism, and we'll come back to that. So when it comes to all of these, again, either we're breaking down energy or we're producing energy or we're using energy. So this is an example of anabolism versus catabolism. So anabolism is going to take your carbohydrates, your fats, and your proteins, break them down into H2O, CO2, and NH3, and then more importantly, it's going to give you a bunch of energy. So you're going to get a lot of chemical energy molecules from there. And guess what happens? That chemical energy is used to produce other molecules. So on this side, you have catabolism. On this side, you have anabolism. And they work together. One produces the energy, the other one uses that energy. That's how they work together. Now, you have a lot of processes in the cell that require energy. So this is just a quick snapshot of things that require energy in your cell. But you have things, you need energy to produce things, you need energy for transport, and you need energy for movement. But you also need energy for many other things as well. Where do we get the energy? From the food, right? So the food that you eat is going to have proteins and polysaccharides and lipids, and then it's going to be broken down in different pathways, right? So we're going to look at different pathways in this video, all of these pathways. So This is from the book that shows you pretty much you have food here. The food has proteins, carbs, and fats. And these, we know that proteins are broken down into amino acids, carbohydrates is broken down into simple sugars, fats are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol, and then they go through different pathways. So sugars go through glycolysis to produce energy. Amino acids and fats also enter pyruvate and acetyl CoA, and the take home message is that in the end you're gonna end up with energy, right? And this is a lot of energy, and we're going to look a little bit about all of these. So pretty much when you look at your food here, you're going to need your proteins, your carbohydrates, your lipids, and your fiber. And we're going to know why we need all of these. But proteins is a good rich source of nitrogen, and it gives you essential amino acids. Carbohydrates are used for energy, and lipids are good components of the membranes, and also they are good signal molecules. We studied every one of these. So you eat food, it's used to give you ATP, which is the body's energy currency, and that energy is used in metabolism, meaning it's used to make a lot of things that your body needs. And then you have a lot of waste in terms of heat, and then chemical waste. So chemical waste is water and carbon dioxide. So this is the overview of the metabolism. But if we zoom in a little bit, it's going to look like this. Proteins, carbohydrates, and fats are broken down, and then they go through a process that ends up giving you ATP. So let's look at one by one. First of all, before we start to look at the process, the things that you eat, such as proteins and carbohydrates and fats, they need to be broken down in order to be used. So we need to break down proteins into amino acids, carbohydrates into just simple sugars, and then fats into fatty acids. So carbohydrates, you have a long sugars, you break them down into simple sugars, no problem. Proteins, you have a polypeptide, you break down the peptide bond so that you have single amino acids, no problem. Fats are usually like this. This is an example of a triglyceride, which is one of the most abundant fats in the food that you eat. So we're gonna break this bond. We break this bond so that you end up with fatty acids and glycerol. So you go from lipids to fatty acids plus glycerol. This is how we need to break this down before we're able to use it. So let's go back and start with carbohydrates. So carbohydrate metabolism. So the carbohydrates metabolism looks like this. So the carbohydrates are broken down into simple sugars such as glucose, and they give you from glucose you get pyruvate to acetyl CoA. It goes through what we call the Krebs cycle, and then it ends up going through the mitochondria, and it gives you ATP. Now all of these look simple, but for example glycolysis, which is going from glucose to pyruvate, is one of the most important processes in the body, and it's very, very intricate, and it looks like this, right? It has, I think, 8 different steps. That is using 8 different enzymes. Actually, we have 9 different enzymes, and these are all very intricate. They are well regulated, and they work together to produce pyruvate and energy. So this is glycolysis. Just this part right here, glycolysis, is very, very important, right? And it produces pyruvate that is used to be transformed into acetyl CoA and goes through the Krebs cycle. Now there is an opposite to glycolysis. So glycolysis is used to break down glucose into usable energy. But what if you have too much glucose? the opposite happens. So we call this gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis is the opposite of glycolysis, where instead of uh, producing pyruvate, we're using the pyruvate to produce the glucose. And glucose eventually gets stored as energy as glycogen, right? So this is the polysaccharides that is very compact and it's branched, and this is how we store energy in our body. So let's go further and see what happens when you uh, continue down the cycle. So this is what we call aerobic respiration. So going back to this, if you made pyruvate, pyruvate goes to acetyl-CoA, and then you have acetyl-CoA goes through what we call a citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle is another important, well-regulated process that is used to transform acetyl-CoA into different energy molecules, right? So those energy molecules are taken into the mitochondrial membrane to transform them into ATP. And this is what we call oxidative phosphorylation, right? So the reason why we say respiration is because this is, by the way, this is why you breathe. This is where oxygen that you breathe is used up. The oxygen that you breathe is used up here in order to produce energy. And the CO2 is also given away here. It's really, really cool. So let's look a little bit about at the citric acid cycle. Even though it looks like one step here, it's an intricate cycle that looks like this. Goes from pyruvate and then you go through a cycle. And from this cycle, you can see that first of all, you produce CO2. This is the CO2 that we produce in respiration. This is the one that you breathe out. This is where it's coming from. But also you produce very, very important energy molecules, right? There are energy molecules that you produce that are really important, that are going to be transported to the next chain. So the energy molecules, namely NADH and FADH, are going to be taken over to the mitochondrial membrane to participate in this step. So if you look at this step here, it looks like this. This is the mitochondrial membrane. And we're not getting into too much details about this, but the NADH that we just talked about, right, is going to be used to pretty much drive transport of electrons, and then the transport of electrons will also drive the transport of hydrogen atoms outside the mitochondrial membrane. And this is going to drive what? It's going to drive this enzyme, ATP synthase, to produce ATP. This is how we produce ATP in the cell. And this last step right here, this is where the oxygen that you breathe is used up. The oxygen that you breathe is used up as an electron acceptor in this process. Isn't that cool? So that's pretty much why we breathe in oxygen and we breathe out CO2. It's used to break down the food that we eat into energy. So if we zoom out a little bit, this is what happens. You have glucose turns into pyruvate gets into the mitochondria, turns into acetyl-CoA goes into the Krebs cycle, producing NADH and FADH, and these go into the electron transport chain in the membrane of the mitochondria to produce 34 ATP. And then you also have 2 ATPs that are produced here, 2 ATPs that are produced in glycolysis. This is all to say that one glucose molecule produces about 38 ATP molecules. One glucose gives you 38 ATP. That's the currency. That's how your food, the food that you eat is transformed into energy. But that was about carbohydrates. Let's look at fatty acids. Fatty acids, first of all, we talked about how if you eat a fatty acid food, it's going to be into glyceride, and then it needs to be broken down into fatty acids before it's used up. It also needs to be transported to the liver and other parts of the body from the intestines before it's used up. So after you transport it, and we transport it using different ways, such as LDL, cytomicrons, and things like that. These are, as you remember, the lipoproteins that transport lipids into blood. So after we do that, we have to oxidize our fats before we use it. So we call this beta oxidation, where you take a fatty acid and guess what you end up with? You end up with acetyl-CoA. Why is this important? It's because the acetyl-CoA that you come up with is used to go into the citric acid cycle, right? We call this Krebs cycle as well. So fatty acid also come into give you acetyl-CoA that is used to produce the ATP, just like we just talked about. So this is how the fatty acids fit into the scheme. What about proteins? Protein metabolism is a little bit intricate, because remember that we have 20 different amino acids, but you have two types of metabolism. Again, remember, you have catabolism and anabolism. So when you eat protein, it's broken down into amino acids, and these amino acids are used to make proteins. So you have structural proteins, regulatory proteins, transport proteins. This is the anabolism, right? We making proteins from amino acids. But we also have catabolism. How do we break down amino acids? There are different ways. The most popular way is what we call urea cycle. The urea cycle breaks down your amino acid into ammonia, and then it goes down through urine, right? But we also have other ways of breaking down, like breaking down amino acids to give you what? To give us acetyl-CoA. Why is this important? Is because, going back to this, you can make proteins, amino acids, and then you produce acetyl-CoA that is used for energy. So your proteins can also be used for energy, which is really cool. So your body uses energy. Your body uses carbs, uses fats, and uses proteins as energy. And this is how it is used to produce ATP. So that's pretty much the overview of it. Now, depending on different regulations and different signals, your body is going to use one over the other. Like, for example, we don't ever use proteins to produce energy unless we're out of carbohydrates. We use carbohydrates first, and under certain conditions, we use fat storage. So we use this as energy, pretty much. And guys, that should be enough. That should be enough for our metabolism, right? Make sure that you understand where all the food that we eat, where it ends up, how it's broken down, how it's transported, and make sure that you understand the difference between anabolism and catabolism. And that should be enough for this video. I'll see you next time.